welcome back to my world of stuff. My name, of course, is Mr. Paul Mount. It's time for a retro movie review. Now, if you saw my video a couple of days ago, my physical media update on my report from the excellent Ace of Wands event in Derby last weekend, you'll have heard me refer to the fact that on the Sunday morning after the event, I had an hour to kill before my taxi took me back to the station for my journey back to South Wales, and I was flicking through the TV in my bedroom and came across the digital channel Legend, which was showing one of my favourite disaster movies, a classic disaster movie, a B movie, but an A-grade B movie. I'm talking about 1965's Crack in the World. This is a film which I first saw early 1970s, I would think, probably in one of those early Saturday night at the movie slots that the BBC used to have back in the day. This was a slot that the BBC used to run in the summer when all the entertainment shows were off the air before the new season. They would show some classic family films in a slot 7 to 8:30 or something like that. And I'm pretty sure that's where I saw Crack of the World. And I'm pretty sure as well, as an impressionable something-year-old, for a little while, Crack in the World was one of my favourite films, and it's interesting that this film was probably the genesis of my interest in this sort of apocalyptic films, end-of-the-world films, all the stuff I keep banging on about, where terrible things happen to the world and people are destroyed and killed in their thousands. And I think it probably started with films like this. And having watched half of the film on Sunday at my hotel, I thought I really had to come back and watch the rest of it and do a review of it, because this is a film that's not really talked about much these days. I think it's quite well regarded amongst those who know of it and remember it. But I think that probably the tide of bigger budgeted, more spectacular disaster films in the 70s, like The Poseidon Adventure, Towering Inferno, Earthquake, Meteor, and all those sorts of things, they probably took this sort of film to another level. So I think that probably the earlier films from the 50s and 60s that tried to do similar things and tell similar stories have been sort of brushed aside a little bit because they weren't spectacular enough. But I came home and I watched the whole film, and it is great fun, a great entertaining piece of popcorn which has a real sense of urgency and excitement about it. And I can understand watching it again, and it's not the first time I've seen it since then. Obviously I've seen it several times. I can understand why it captured my imagination so vividly, because it has this sense of pace and energy and urgency about it, and this sense of impending catastrophe because the world is in serious trouble. If you've never seen the film, there are basically three main cast members. We've got veteran actor Dana Andrews, who plays Professor Stephen Sorensen. We've got his young wife Maggie, played by Jeanette Scott, and we've got the square-jawed, muscular, hunky hero Ted Rampion, played by Kieran Moore. If anything, I would say he's a bit too square-jawed for his own good. The plot of the film basically is that in a massive underground complex in the deserts of Tanganyika, although the film was actually shot in Spain, a massive borehole project is underway to dig down through the Earth's crust. Professor Sorensen believes that if they can penetrate the Earth's crust under controlled conditions, they can capture and harness the energy of the very core of the Earth itself, unleashing a sustainable energy source that will benefit mankind for generations to come. It's interesting that this film, which dates back to 1964-65, touched on ecological issues which are of great concern to us now. I think there's a line which references poisoning the Earth's sea. So environmental issues were at the forefront of a lot of people's minds even back in the 60s. Sorensen is convinced that detonating a thermonuclear device will penetrate the crust of the Earth. They've managed to drill down so far, but they got a bit stuck. And at the beginning of the film, a group of financiers and scientists and officials and so on have come to the complex to hear from Sorensen and to be reassured about the status of the project and the safety of the project, because they're daring to go where no man has gone before. One of Sorensen's former pupils, Ted Rampion, played by Kieran Moore, as I mentioned, he is convinced that there are huge risks in detonating a thermonuclear device. It could cause a cataclysmic crack in the core of the Earth, which could tear the planet apart. Sorensen manages to persuade his visitors that his procedure is safe. Rampion is not so sure, however. The film actually starts off a few days before this. The film actually kicks off a few days before the missile is launched down into the borehole. When it does launch, even though Rampion has rushed back to London to try and put a stop to it, it appears that everything goes well. The missile drops into the borehole, there's a huge explosion, magma spurts out, a bit like you see in the oil fields, spurts out into the air and leaves deposits of already smelt metals and minerals that can be used in industry. Sorensen's experiment has been a huge success. Ted Rampion has returned to his side, chastened. His theory, it appears, was incorrect until things go a little bit wrong. There are suddenly a number of devastating earthquakes which suggest that perhaps all is not well. And eventually they discover that a huge crack has opened up and is racing round the surface of the planet, and if it's not stopped, it will indeed tear the planet apart. This then is the core, if you pardon the pun, story of Crack in the World, and this all happens within the first 35 minutes. We set up our characters, we set up what's going on, we set up a bit of human drama as well, which I'll go back to shortly, and the explosion takes place and the world is suddenly in peril. And the last 50 minutes of the film are all about desperate attempts to try and stop this crack racing its way around the earth, trying to send it in a different direction. It's all very tense and all very exciting and all very spectacular. 60 years on from its making, Crack in the World is still a terrific piece of entertainment. As I said, lots of films that have come since are much more spectacular than this. I'm not going to go on about CGI again, because we know about CGI and all the stuff they can do in films these days. All the disaster movies of the 70s which took this sort of film up a notch. But this still has a very raw primeval power. The primeval power of the core of the earth itself, if you will. And it's very well put together. It's a very competent script. The film is directed by Andrew Martin. The script is by John Manchip and Julian Zimmett. And it's actually very literate and very articulate and very well considered. I'll talk briefly about the effects. This was made on a budget of a little under $1 million. I think it's about $875,000. And there are some very good effect sequences in this. There are a lot of very good model scenes, which are actually quite reminiscent of the work of Jerry and Sylvia Anderson. There's the scenes with the missile that's going to be launched into the borehole on its gantry, cars and little miniature cars running by. That's very Jerry Anderson. There's another very spectacular and quite terrifying set piece where a train plunges into a ravine when the bridge collapses and hundreds of people on board the train are obviously killed outright. There's lots of stock footage, of course, of volcanoes and explosions and so on. And there's undeniable gaps in the film's scientific logic. In one particular scene, they drop a atomic bomb into a volcano in hopes of stopping the crack by detonating a pocket of hydrogen. After much excitement and much tension, they drop the bomb into the volcano. Everybody retreats a couple of miles back to the shoreline and watch the explosion. There's a massive nuclear explosion. We see some, again, stock footage of a nuclear explosion. But they're just watching happily on the island. There's no tidal wave, there's no tsunami, there's no particular after effects. The island is just destroyed. And of course, the end of the film is quite ludicrous from a scientific point of view, when what happens, happens. And even though this film is 60 years old, I'm not going to spoil it for you, because I suspect a lot of you might not have seen this film and hopefully will be interested in tracking it down. But the ending is apocalyptic, or should be apocalyptic, but isn't. It has a sort of a slightly silly happy ending. But that's all by the by, because this is a great entertaining film. It's very well made. I think the sets are fantastic. There's a real sense of sort of Bond villain about the underground complex in Tanganyika. And there's some genuine spectacle. As I say, that the effects are very good for the time that it's made. But what makes the film work is this growing sense of unease that something horrible is going to happen, that the world is in danger and that the planet could be completely destroyed. I did mention that there's an emotional core to the film, and I noticed looking back at some reviews of the film that came out at the time and retrospective over the years, there's a lot of criticism about the love triangle, if you like, between the three main characters. Sorensen is an older man. He has married Maggie. She had a thing going with Ted Rampion earlier on, but she made her choice and married Stephen Sorensen. And he obviously feels a bit insecure about that because Ted Rampion is still on the scene. And as I said, he's this rugged action hero. And Stephen's obviously worried about losing Maggie. I think it's a shame that some critics have said, oh, it's a bit soap opera. All the soap opera stuff's really boring. And I do find it odd that people now regard human drama and human interest as soap opera. I think that's the pervasive effect that perhaps soap operas over the years have had on people's understanding of stories and people and drama, is that anything that involves people behaving like people is considered to be soap opera. Because if it wasn't for this strand of humanity of these characters. They would just be ciphers walking around doing things with no humanity to them. And there's an added humanity, of course, to Stephen Sorensen's plight, because he is suffering from a debilitating disease. It's clearly cancer, although it's not named as cancer in the film. And the first time we see him, he's being treated by a doctor with his hand between two x-ray plates, and he's got this rash across his hand. The doctor who's treating him at this stage knows that this is incurable, but he hasn't told him yet. And Sorensen wraps a bandage around the rash so he doesn't show it to people. And this also sort of causes a schism between him and Maggie. I think he knows he's an older man. He's probably going to die. Maggie wants a child with him, but he's not prepared to take that step. And yes, it is the stuff that you get, I suppose, in EastEnders and Coronation Street. But why can't you have this sort of human colour in a fantasy film? And it does seem very odd that fans of these films won't tolerate this sort of thing because it's soap opera. It was criticism we've heard a lot about Doctor Who over the years, all the soap opera stuff with the Doctor and Rose and the Doctor and River and so on. It's just adding a bit of colour and light and shade to people who would just be ciphers otherwise. So Cracking the World is a hugely entertaining film, which obviously is of its era. And I think, you, again, as I say with all these films when I talk about them, you have to think about that and think that this is a 60-year-old film with 60-year-old production values and narrative values. But it doesn't stop it being fantastically entertaining and pretty spectacular. I watched it here in the cinema room again tonight, and it really looks good. The colour is vibrant on the Blu-ray, and it's got a good pace to it. And the script, as I said, is very literate and very thought-provoking. Great performances too. I mean, Dana Andrews was always a good, solid actor. It was interesting to see Kieran Moore and Jeanette Scott reunited because, of course, they appeared in the rather weak adaptation of Day the Triffids just a couple of years earlier, which was produced, as was this film, by Philip Yordan, which presumably is why they were brought back together in this film. And they have a real on-screen chemistry. Jeanette Scott, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, the daughter of the legendary British entertainer Thora Hird. And it was one of the last things that Jeanette did. She only did a couple of things after this, not entirely sure why. Kieran Moore himself, he gave up acting several years later, and I think he found religion. And he lived out the rest of his life fairly quietly away from the glare of the camera. So it's a good film. It's a good entertaining film, and it's one which I think has been unfairly sort of forgotten over the years. It doesn't obviously get screened very often these days. But if you are interested in seeing it, as I say, it was on Legend on the weekend. It may well be on their rota of films at the moment. So you might find it on their schedule coming up in the next week or so. It is available on Blu-ray if you want to pick it up there. It also has an interesting and informative commentary by Alan Bryce, who's the editor of Dark Side and Infinity magazines, and film historian Richard Hollis. So it's worth picking up, and it looks great on Blu-ray. So that's Cracking the World, cracking film. I'm going to give it a big chunky 8 out of 10 for Cracking the World. Right, I do hope you've enjoyed this video. I've enjoyed making it, so we're halfway there. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. It'd be fantastic to have you aboard. We do lots of retro film reviews, retro TV, new TV, unboxings, all the stuff, all that sort of stuff, but from the perspective of me. So please press that subscribe button. Like, leave a comment down below if you feel so inclined. And if you're looking at this t-shirt thinking that's rather smart, you can get one by clicking on the link in the description below, which will send you over to a site where you can pick one up at a very reasonable cost. So there we are, that's me done for this. I will see you very soon. Until I do, keep taking the stuff.